Welcome to the Glazov gang. Tonight, Monty Morton, a conservative entrepreneur and a walking encyclopedia, and he is back by popular demand. Monty, welcome back to the Glazov gang.
Thank you, Jamie. Glad to be here.
Tonight, Monty Morton will be reminding us of the two great threats to America. There are many, but tonight he will discuss two, hoping that the world is not forgetting these threats to American security and health. Monty Morton, take it away.
Let's get to it. In trying to decide exactly, or thinking about what the two greatest threats to America might be, I came up with two. And the first one, which jumped into my mind immediately, was our growing debt. And I thought that what we might do is start off, if we could show a quote from the Congressional Budget Office, and if we have that slide, if we can put that slide up. As you can see here, based upon what the CBO said, it says that the growing federal debt will increase the probability of a sudden fiscal crisis during which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage the budget, and the government would thereby lose its ability to borrow at affordable rates. Such a crisis would probably have very significant impact on the country. Before we go on, we hear about a national debt of approaching $18 trillion. And it's very, very difficult to get your head around what the significance of that number is or how large that number is. So if I might, there's one more slide that I'd like to show. And if we can show this slide, I think it succinctly shows the significance of a $17.5 trillion debt. Here we see the national debt in numbers. And if we read through it, it really is rather mind-boggling. 17 trillion, 749 billion, 820 million, $713,747.83. That is a huge number. And the question becomes, what does this mean? And how real is this number? To understand the debt, one of the things that we have to look at, Jamie, and this is what all academics look at, it's the amount of debt that a government has to its total gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is nothing more than the sum of all the goods and services that a particular economy puts out in a particular year. And the reason why this metric is important and why people in the know look at it is because countries are different. Countries have different metrics. They have different debts. They have different gross domestic products. For example, if you look at Germany, which has a huge economy, they have a debt that's much higher than Greece. But Greece's output is much smaller. So the percentage of debt to GDP in Greece is much more leveraged than, let's say, Germany is. And Greece is in the danger area where Germany is not. And if we take a look at various countries, and some of you may have heard of what we call the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Those are countries that in the last decade have suffered significant economic malaise, significant debt. And what the academics look at is when an economy exceeds 100% debt to GDP, that somewhat becomes the danger area. That's when the alarms and that's when the bells start to go off. So if we look at Portugal, for example, their debt to GDP is 129%. We know Italy's 132%, and 2 or 3 years ago, if we look back at all the problems that Greece had, possibly defaulting on their debt, and their ratio was 156%. And if we go back to Japan and their lost decade, they basically lost a decade in economic malaise. Their ratio of debt to GDP is 220%. And the reason why I point that out is because I want to set some benchmarks. Because I want the viewers to clearly see where the United States is today and where it was before. For example, during the Reagan administration, the highest ratio was 49%. And George Bush, who really didn't do us any favors with the economy, because he increased the debt from 5.8 trillion to 10 trillion, we were at about 75%. Ladies and gentlemen, our economy is really no different than those countries in Europe. We have now exceeded 100%. Our debt to GDP is 107%, and it's going to continue to get worse. And the reason why it's going to get worse, Jamie, is because we are still in an annual deficit spending. Right now, our spending is about $3.6 trillion a year. The revenues that we have to balance that are only about $3 trillion. So for 2013, 2014, we're going to add another $600 billion to that $17.5 trillion. Question: how are we going to pay the interest on our national debt? And this is where it becomes scary. Very scary, ladies and gentlemen. Currently, the interest on our national debt is about $250 to $300 billion. And that's manageable. And it's only manageable because since the economic meltdown, the Federal Reserve has engaged in what we call quantitative easing. And quantitative easing was nothing more than the Federal Reserve taking investors out of the marketplace to buy United States debt, and the Fed is buying its own debt, thereby keeping interest rates very, very low. We basically are spending $250 billion a year on interest, and when rates rise, Jamie, and they will, because quantitative easing is going to end in October, the interest on our national debt will go from about 7.5% of revenues to close to 25% of revenues. It'll go from $250 billion to close to $800 billion. And here's the kicker, folks. Where will the money come from? There's only 2 or 3 places the government can get money. We can increase taxes, we can decrease spending, or we can print more money. And as we print more money, what's going to happen with the value of your existing money? It's going to get devalued. It's going to get debased. That, to me, is one of the biggest dangers facing our economy. And finally, the dirty little secret that we have that no one talks about has to do with the unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Social Security, which exceed about $50 trillion.
Thank you so much, Monty. Let us get on to the second great threat to the United States. We left it a little bit as an adventurous mystery for the viewers. And you say that it is Iran. Now, of course, ISIS is a tremendous threat, and we're not minimizing the threat of ISIS in any way. But because ISIS is very much in the news lately for very legitimate reasons, you want to remind our viewers of the great threat that Iran also poses, and on a few realms, a greater threat on a few realms. ISIS poses great threats on several realms. We're going to talk about the threat that Iran poses and that you want to remind our viewers about. So go ahead.
This president has been passive or neglectful on the subject of jihad. And ISIS is certainly an imminent, if not a pressing threat. But what concerns me about ISIS is basically what this administration is doing, what this administration has said, and how this administration telegraphs itself to our enemies. For example, Obama has said that the reason why ISIS has grown is because of bad intelligence, and they underestimated the threat. Well, that is absolutely false. He throws his director of intelligence, James Clapper, under the bus. Then the next day, his press secretary, Josh Earnest, I believe his name is, walks that back and says, no, Obama supports James Clapper. And yet, Obama calls ISIS a junior varsity team. we are being lied to by the administration. We're being lied to as to the threat, which is terrific. It's a terrific threat. And we're being lied to as to what the president knew and when he knew it. And here's the deal. This president has been receiving security briefings for the better part of a year. And for them to say that it was bad intelligence and they underestimated ISIS, then the question that I would have is, how could they underestimate ISIS when ISIS penetrated the Syria border? How could they underestimate ISIS when ISIS marched into Fallujah, a town which we brought stability to and people died for? This administration has known that for over a year. And in the final analysis, what does ISIS want? They want the same thing as Hezbollah. They want the same thing as Al-Qaeda. They want the same thing as all of these radical Islamist groups. They want to establish a caliphate in the Middle East. They want to go to Europe and occupy it. And once they do that, they're coming to the United States. But that is not the greatest threat. That's the threat as it exists today. The greatest threat that I see is not ISIS. And in case no one has noticed, the world is a mess. And it's a mess primarily due to a lack in leading from behind mentality of our president. And our enemies know it. We have a president, Jamie, who seems confused. He makes bold, assertive statements and then does nothing. For example, and let's talk about the biggest threat that I see, and that's a nuclear Iran. Back in 2002, before a meeting with Netanyahu, Obama reaffirmed his pledge to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. He even rejected a policy of a self-contained Iran, just letting them have some nuclear weapon, not nuclear weapons, but maybe nuclear reactors for energy. That was also that's something he didn't want. Then Obama said, I think that Israel recognized that as President of the United States, I don't bluff. Really? What happened to his red line? What happened when Putin marched into Crimea? And again, doesn't our president recognize that our enemies see everything? They're aware of everything? And then he said, I don't, as a matter of policy, go around advertising exactly what our intentions are. Really? Didn't he give a date certain withdrawal from Iraq? Didn't he just recently say there'll be no boots on the ground in Iran or in Iraq or Syria? That's exactly what the president does. He's dealt a hand and then he shows his cards. And then Obama said this sobering statement. The dangers of Iran getting weapons that then leads to a free-for-all in the Middle East is something that I think is very dangerous for the world. I have no disagreement with that, but those were words. There is no action. The reality, Jamie, Iran has been trying to become a nuclear power for 2 decades. And while Obama might want to delude himself into thinking Iran's enrichment is only for domestic purposes, he might want to remember what President Hashemi Rafsanjani said in 1988, and I just want to quote it. To fully equip ourselves in the offensive and defensive use of chemical and radiological weapons. What part of that doesn't the president understand? And yet, what does this president do? He apologizes. He panders. He apologizes to France and Europe. He apologizes to the Muslim world. He apologized to the Summit of the Americas. He apologized at the G20 summit. He apologizes for the war on terror. He apologizes for Gitmo. So with respect to not allowing a nuclear Iran, what does our president do? He lifts sanctions before any negotiations. Iran receives $7 billion in economic sanction relief. Iran goes from 10,000 centrifuges to 19,000 centrifuges. And then at the UN, Kerry turns to UN and asks them to be part of a coalition to help fight ISIS. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because Iran, what they're going to want is they're going to want a quid pro quo, and they're going to want us to even reduce or take away more sanctions. And the sanctions are already collapsing. In my opinion, this president has surrendered nuclear weapons already. It's a fait accompli. And what happened to Iran cannot possess nuclear weapons? I have no idea. And let me finish with this thought, because this, to me, is the most chilling thought. When Iran goes nuclear, and I think they will, what will countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and all other non-nuclear Middle East countries want? They'll want nuclear weapons. Then what?
Monty Morton, it was an honor and a privilege to have you on the Glazov Gang. Thank you for
Jamie.
Warning us.
Thank you.
Thank you for informing our viewers and also warning the world about these two great threats to the United States, to the world, and the tragedy of having this radical in chief in power during these terrible times.
My pleasure, Jamie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Monty, very much. Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang this week. We'll see you next week. Good night.